The thing is about settler colonialism is that it's always has like one glaring deficiency, and that is that it requires my people's erasure.
As California Native people, we understand the extent of genocide.
Dehumanization is an essential part to greasing the engine of genocidal violence, eradication, and replacement of settler colonialism.
This being a quote-unquote war for Western civilization, this is all incredibly familiar language that has been used to justify settler colonial violence in the U.S. and in California specifically.
You are listening to the Challenging Colonialism podcast. This is the first part of a very special three-part series that differs slightly from our usual content. While our podcast typically centers the voices and perspectives of Indigenous Californians, this episode centers the perspective of Indigenous Palestinians. Please note that these interviews were conducted between December 2023 and February 2024. We are publishing this in April 2024, and yet the genocide continues with no sign of a ceasefire or an end to the occupation of Palestine in sight. Part 1 explores commonalities and parallels in settler colonialism in Palestine and California. Please be advised this episode will include graphic discussions of dispossession, ethnic cleansing, and genocide.
My name is Noor Judah. I am an assistant professor at UCLA. My story, like most Palestinians, is a bit scattered. I was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. My father was teaching there at the time. He was a history professor at King Saud University. And when I was 4, we were kicked out of Saudi Arabia, and we were one of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were kicked out of the Gulf as a whole. So during the Gulf War, as a result of Yasser Arafat's position, he was chairman of the PLO at the time, of course, taking a stand against American intervention, American bases in the Gulf. And as far as the Kuwaitis were concerned, that meant siding with Saddam Hussein. So Palestinians all over the Gulf region really very quickly became persona non grata and had their residencies and work permits revoked. And so from the very beginning, my childhood was an experience of, let's say, involuntary movement, of displacement, of immigration stories and all of that. So from there, my parents sent me and 2 of my siblings to Libya to stay with my aunts for about a year while they worked on papers to get us into the US. They were able to go there and have the US as an option because my 2 oldest brothers were actually born in the US while my dad had been finishing his PhD back in the late 60s here in the US. And so that was an option for us that it wasn't for many people. I came to the US at age 5, and aside from many visits back to the Middle East, including to Gaza to visit family, I grew up mostly in Tennessee from K through 12, and then undergrad also. And I left Tennessee after undergrad and went to DC for work and grad school, and have been in California since 2016. My family is from a village in Palestine called Isdoud. It's about 25 miles north of Gaza. Before 1948, our family tree that we have record of, anyhow, in Isdoud goes back about 300 years. Isdoud, like most villages, was largely rural and agriculturally driven. And as a coastal town, was part of what was at the time the Palestinian breadbasket. Both my mother's side and my father's side are from the same village. And for my father, he actually grew up there. My dad is 90 years old now. He was 14 during the Nakba, so very sort of cognizant of what was happening. And his entire childhood was in Isdoud. He remembers quite vividly the trek to Gaza on foot in October of 48. I know most people think of the Nakba as a moment in May of 48, but especially for southern Palestine, the displacement and emptying of the villages isn't really complete until well into the following fall. My mother was born once they arrived in what is now known as the Gaza Strip. They walked all the way down to Rafah, which, if you've been following the news, right, is the southernmost tip of the strip. My grandmother was 7 months pregnant with my mom in the fall of 48, and my mom was born in a tent in Rafah in the early winter of 49. She was actually born during the first Israeli aerial bombardment of Gaza, which happens in early winter of 49. And a dud actually lands right next to my grandmother's tent while she was in labor with my mom. Obviously, they both lived. And it became a bit of a running joke in the family. So every time my mother would get sick and my grandmother would worry or panic, my grandfather would sort of wink and chuckle and tell her, "Don't worry, if the bomb didn't kill her, influenza is not going to take her out." Um, so I think for me, the fact that the stories of the Nakba were such a core part of my family story growing up was also a bit unique for my generation, in the sense that it wasn't my grandparents' story the way that it was for many of my peers. But as the youngest of 5 kids, and the fact that my parents had me later in life and so on, it was my mother and father's story directly, right? And it lived in our house and upbringing in really central and very permanent ways that are hard to always kind of fully explain.
My name is Layla, and I am from Palestine. I am from a city that is currently under a military occupation in the West Bank. It's the city of Al-Khalil. It's Judaicized as Hebron. Al-Khalil is a really holy city. The word Khalil means companion, and it's a reference to Abraham, who was buried there, who was often referred to as God's companion. Al-Khalil is also known for a lot of creative arts, such as ceramics and blown glass. It's also known for having beautiful vineyards that extend across the city and even outside of the city. Much of the old city of Al-Khalil is a ghost town because it has been stolen from us. Israeli settlers now live on the second stories of what was once a thriving market where my parents grew up, where they went to school, where my family still lives. They were obviously pushed out of the old city. Now it's overrun by settlers who live above what used to be these thriving markets and a place of Palestinian life. Now Al-Khalil is overrun by tanks and armed settlers who are supported by their military, which is supported by the United States. My family, therefore, lives in extremely difficult conditions. Everyday life is marked by violence. Currently, I live in the Phoenix area, lands belonging to 23 Native nations. I'm grateful to be a guest here. And as I understand from my Palestinian experience, that though we are not a state, we carry our nation with us and we know exactly where we belong and where it is. Our nation is something that those of us who are displaced from it live and breathe, and so much of that is through everyday practices like our food traditions and replicating our land relations in the diaspora. So things like harvesting olives, for example, has a special significance to us because olive cultivation began in Palestine in the Jalil al-Arabi, or the Galilee, approximately 7,000 years ago. Palestinians are the original olive cultivators in history. And the oldest, or one of the oldest olive trees in the world is located in a beautiful Palestinian village called Al-Walaja, which is very close to Al-Khalil. Of course, they are separated by an apartheid wall, a very violent identification regime, checkpoints, surveillance technologies, watchtowers, heavy policing. It's a place where there is extensive incarceration.
My own research and writing is about Palestinian indigenous epistemologies, both coming from the homeland and in our diaspora. And I come to you from the gorgeous Southwest, where I'm surrounded by olive trees, lemon trees, cacti, palm trees, and all kinds of things that remind me of my homeland. My research asks how indigenous food practices become a way to mediate the relationship between indigenous people and our homelands, and the ways in which settler colonialism is refused through everyday practices of cooking, harvesting, planting, foraging, and writing about food. half of the entire population of Palestinians lives outside of our homeland. So we are an indigenous population, but we're also a largely diasporic population, one of the longest, most enduring refugee crises, as they call us, now in our seventh decade. Homeland is in this way very different than the nation state. So when I say that I'm part of the Palestinian homeland, it's different than saying I'm part of a Palestinian state, because Palestinians are stateless people who are denied our right of return. So to me, homeland is this wedding of people and land in this relationship of reciprocity that exceeds the current period, but harkens back to our ancestors and their relationship to these lands, their relationship to the natural world. And for Palestinians, this really is symbolized by the olive tree. And my research, therefore, is to look at the ways in which the olive tree has continued to sustain our identities in the context of genocidal erasure and ongoing settler colonialism.
I am Rana Sharif. I use she, her, he pronouns, and I'm the very proud daughter of Palestinian refugees who settled in as arrivants on the land of the Chumash, Tonga, and Bernardino Tataviam peoples, the original caretakers and stewards of the city of Los Angeles, or the City of Angels, as we often like to refer to LA. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, an educator, social justice activist. I'm an organizer with the Palestinian Feminist Collective, and I get to host and produce shows for the Swana Region Radio Collective on Pacifica's KPFK. And so I'm coming into this space as someone who's lived the experience of being a Palestinian in the diaspora, second generation, and really bringing that to this conversation, but also as someone who is part of a legacy of folks in the academic spaces, educators, grassroots mobilizers who are really centering Palestine in the many facets of our lives. To me, and I mean, I don't mean to be reductive in the way that I present it, because there's nothing reductive about its kind of effects. To me, settler colonialism is a death-making project. And in that process, it is aimed at dispossession, destruction, and erasure of indigenous communities, our languages, our cultures, our foods, our knowledge, our lands, our entire beings. In settler states, like the United States or Israel, its logics seep into and inform all power systems and structures, from politics and media to, quote, culture and art. It is a system of punitive and extractive violence. And I think what I think is really important about defining the parameters of settler colonialism is also to see the kind of insidious and intimate ways it seeps into all aspects of our lives. And in fact, I'm reminded of the work of Antonio Gramsci and like hegemony, right? So it's like the way in which our cultural institutions kind of are the arbiters and like the distributors of this death-making project. And I think that's important because oftentimes we look for spectacular forms of violence, right? Like, which we see, right? There's killing and death and destruction. And genocide in the kind of like capital G genocide. But there are ways in which this death-making project is lodged into every aspect of life in settler states. We can step back and kind of take, like, if we were to take a bird's eye view and look over what it means to live under occupation, to kind of see the architecture, the way in which the occupied world is built. For Palestinians in Gaza, it looks different than it does in the West Bank and most certainly in heartland Palestine. But what I'll focus on perhaps is really the military occupation that is in the West Bank, where you see checkpoints, raids, high incarceration rates because there's administrative detention, the arrests, the arbitrary arrests. You see the policing and monitoring of air, land, and sea in Gaza. You're seeing the way in which all aspects of everyday life are controlled by a military occupation. So you have checkpoints, you have the Batunstantization, excuse me, for having to break that down, of the temporal geography. So you are creating these kind of cloistered, segmented off lands and spaces of communities that are very much removed from communities, their peers, their neighbors, their family, their kin, vis-a-vis the apartheid and separation wall that Israel is erecting, completely closing off communities. So there's only one entrance, one exit to any given community. And this is something that we're going to see increase. The settlements, the way in which they are taking up Palestinian land, our olive groves, the ways in which they are actually extracted from, removed from their Palestinian caretakers. Every aspect of Palestinian life is surveilled, monitored, controlled. These are the ways in which Palestinians are living every day, day in, day out, the architecture of an occupation. And this architecture is punitive, it's violent, it's corrosive, it erases. And there are different ways in which it impacts Palestinian communities. There is the physical removal from land. There's the psychological terror and warfare. There is the constant state of terror and fear that Palestinians live under. Palestinian children, for example, are ripped from their families and taken into administrative detention. Israel is one of the only countries in the world that detains Palestinian children. The raids, the night raids oftentimes, even accessing a water well, going to school for children, being able to get healthcare for chronic illnesses. Several years ago, I did ride-alongs with Palestinians throughout the West Bank who were receiving medical treatment in Jerusalem. So they had to receive specialized approvals to be able to go into Jerusalem to receive care for chronic illnesses. And every month they would have to prove that they were dying so that they could actually receive care. And what we're seeing in Gaza is a different form of military occupation where air, land, and sea are completely under Israel's control. What comes in, what comes out of the Gaza Strip is entirely controlled by the Zionist state. They are on a calorie diet, how much food comes in. All we see is every aspect of Palestinian life come under the Zionist state's control.
Brittany Arona. So my name is Brittany Arona. I am a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe in Northwestern California, and also currently a UC President's and Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at UC Santa Cruz. Settler colonialism is not something of the past. It is very much in the present. And settler colonial nations, when they're founded to destroy, to replace an indigenous population, depend on the continued destruction of those indigenous peoples. And you're seeing that right now in Palestine with the destruction of homes, of families, the forced removal of people from their homes, moving them north and south, and then bombing them right after. Like, that's actually settler colonial violence and genocide. And by every definition of genocide that exists, especially the very famous UN Convention of 1948, this is what would be constituted as a genocide. And that's not even really a question for scholars who study these types of atrocities, mass atrocities in the world. The historical situation and the contemporary situation really denote the making of Israel as a settler colonial nation, backed by a huge settler colonial nation, the United States. Settler colonialism is often defined through articulations from Patrick Wolfe. So many people go back to Wolfe's articulations of settler colonialism as a logic of elimination, as an ongoing structure of power that systematically erases indigenous people from the land. So through many different ways, that could be through genocide, assimilation, often very violent, and replaces them with settlers from around the world. So when you hear settler colonialism and scholars talking about settler colonialism, they're often talking about destroy to replace. So you destroy the indigenous population of a location that you are occupying. So scholars often refer, including myself, as the United States as being a settler colonial nation. So destroying to replace with the new population of settlers coming in. This has often been articulated in Native American and Indigenous studies, and then human rights. People tend to look at 1948 as really the start, quote unquote, of what is ongoing with Palestinians today, so the Nakba, the catastrophe. But settler colonialism in Palestine can really be traced back to 1896 with Theodor Herzl, who calls for the creation of the Jewish state. So his discussion around the Jewish state really denotes the beginning of like this settler colonial project that happens in Palestine and forms the state of Israel. So from his own writings, he writes, "If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct." So this is the architect and the founder of the Zionist movement that happens in 1896 and then moves forward with partition and the removal of Palestinian people from their homeland into what we see today with Gaza and the West Bank. So I can't, claim to be a Palestinian historian or even really an expert on the Middle East. But once you start learning more about this history of Palestine and the really, really violent history of removal and destruction and ethnic cleansing and genocide that's happening to Palestinians and has been happening for 75 years and beyond that, you really can't see it as anything other than a settler colonial project. It really is this destroy to replace. Israeli settlers in the military, backed by the United States government, is really working to remove Palestinian peoples from their homelands. And from that, too, you see a lot of both violence. So you see genocidal violence as a function of that. We're seeing it now as bombs are being dropped in Gaza and as people are being attacked in the West Bank.
My name is Renda. I'm a Palestinian from Jerusalem and from the village of Birzeit in the West Bank, but I grew up in the Bay Area and I just returned here and live in Oakland now. So I've been living in Palestine on and off for the past decade. First, I was working as a human rights advocacy coordinator at Damir, which is a prisoners support organization in Ramallah that provides free legal aid to Palestinian political prisoners. And then I've had the opportunity to go back to Palestine a lot in the past 5-6 years to do my research for my PhD in anthropology, which I finished just a few months ago, working on Palestine. So I think the most widely adopted definition of settler colonialism is that a foreign population arrives onto a land that's inhabited by its indigenous population and believe that it is theirs, so they try to establish it as their own, and therefore they force the indigenous population off the land using violence, genocide, exiling them, dispossessing them, in order to replace them and entrench a new historical narrative of the land as them as the owners. And to me, I think this very bare bones definition captures, at minimum, what settler colonialism looks like in its originating moment and in its daily practice, how it looks through the structures of military occupation, of apartheid, of how the law is practiced and how the law is used, how mass incarceration plays out. And of course, in moments like this, of the ongoing genocide and the very horrifying violence that we're witnessing in Gaza today to remove the Palestinian population. And for me, I think while these are the general definition of what settler colonialism looks like materially, I feel like I've become less interested in examining the specific mechanisms of settler colonialism, like how it manifests as walls and checkpoints and the ways that the indigenous population is controlled, the revocation of ID cards to dispossess them. And I think these are all really important to understand how it works materially. But I've become more interested in articulating and naming settler colonialism and thinking about how it's kind of an embodied violence, one that is often predicated on humiliating the indigenous population and as a practice of erasure, of trying to erase them and sever them from their identity as indigenous and trying to sever them from their own dignity in order to sever them from the land. And so there's this doctor named Dr. Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who's a Palestinian criminologist in Jerusalem, and she's coined this phrase, occupation of the senses, to get at this idea of the way settler colonialism kind of manifests as an overwhelming, all-encompassing presence, and how our bodies that are constantly being made to feel alienated and excluded, even at our most like at the level of our DNA and at the level of our body. And some of these ideas are like through smell, the stench of skunk water and tear gas permeating in Palestinian homes and in the air of our communities. Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem overcrowded with the stench of garbage because they are systematically denied services. It's through eyesight, through the projections of Zionist symbols on Palestinian holy sites and being accustomed to seeing soldiers and military anytime you move from city to city. It's through touch, from being assaulted, from being always patted down, strip searched, prodded, physically confined by the military and soldiers against your will. It's through sound and the way our othering and displacement and exclusion of from the land are made and created by the settler state. And so this is how settler colonialism, and in the Palestinian context, how Zionist settler colonialism is an attempt to sever us from our land by forcing our exclusion to seep like physically into our pores and into our DNA. And I think for me, this concept of occupation of the senses has really resonated with me because it articulates more closely what I have felt to be the daily tensions that we have to contend with when living under a settler colonial regime and under settler colonial violence. And it also speaks to how, as Indigenous people, we preserve and maintain ourselves under the violence and humiliation of settler colonial control, despite it seeping into the most intimate spaces of our body and how it is embodied.
My name's Karina Gould. I am the tribal chair for the Confederated Villages of Lashawn Nation. I'm also the co-founder and co-director of the Segorte Land Trust, the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust in the country. This comes straight out of a playbook of the United States government, a blueprint of what has happened to Indigenous people across the world, perfected by what the United States did when they came here and started to take over Indigenous lands. And so it's sad to see the correlations of what happened to Native people in Turtle Island, what happened to my people through the mission system, the Mexican Rancho period, the current occupation of the United States government. To think that, there's still this idea of genocide in our own territories when I come from a tribal people that are not recognized by the government that are now on our own lands. That there's this continuous genocide by this wiping away, this idea of not having a memory, this pretending or whitewashing of history. We see that right now in current day where they are trying to erase ethnic studies, that they don't want people of color stories told. Being a mom and a grandmother, to imagine, I can't imagine what is happening there. That, there are prayers all the time. Of course, I pray for those moms and those dads that are waiting for their relatives to come home, that are hostages. But I look at all the thousands and thousands of Palestinian people who have had also their entire lineage wiped away. And what does that mean? And how are humans not being human anymore?
Hestam, Natoya Vanessa Escobedo, ni Noromak Heport Choki Ambus. Hi, my name is Vanessa Escobedo. I'm an enrolled member of the Noromak Wintu Nation. I'm also part Hupa and Chicana. I think growing up, it's kind of taught in a way that it's like an event. People come in, they colonize in the end. But I like the term settler colonialism because it gives, power to the fact that it's continuing, it's ongoing, that we still live in a settler colonial state, and how settler colonialism continues to affect so many aspects of everyday life. I mean, a lot of the genocide and the disposition has already happened here in California, right? They moved us out, they put us on reservations, but they don't talk about how it still continues. Criminalizing Native peoples on just regular access to their cultures, having access to go on private property to gather acorns, gather basket material. That's all part of settler colonialism. Still removing the things we need to do to be who we are. I'm Wintu, so for me to practice those things, I need to be able to have access, and we don't. I'm not part of a fairly recognized tribe, so if I get caught with the eagle feather, like technically, right, I can get fined, and so on and so forth. Like, these are smaller examples of settler colonialism, but I think they're important because it's a continued act of separate and displace from our culture.
My name is Dr. Stephanie Lumsden, and I'm a Hoopa tribal member and a PPFP fellow at UC Santa Cruz in the history department. Israel as an idea starts with that very sentimental kind of trap of searching for a homeland from a people who have historically been persecuted and genocided against. But then to use that sentimentality, to use that one's own victimization as a kind of smokescreen through which to invade and perpetuate violence against Indigenous persons who are already understood as less than people because of white supremacy. I think that is the historical context of Israel. And there's a lot, of course, of propaganda to cover up, just like in the United States. We have any number of nationalist myths and holidays and statues, and every state has an Astoria and a Portland and a Washington. And all of those are examples of a longstanding structure through which everyday violence of dispossession occurs. I see the same thing happening with Israel, but we have this kind of nationalist myth of origin, of even divine providence. God delivered us to this place as kind of an I'm sorry for our historical injuries and that no one is going to deny. Israel as a state, just like the United States, is illegitimate. It's a settler state. It's authored its own legality. It was the dream of violent people, and we are seeing the realization of those nightmares now. California Indian people know very well and know intimately in our bodies and in our dreams that settler states remove us from the freedom we once knew. They remove us from our full expressions of personhood and the real spiritedness of our beautiful homelands. They steal those things from us. And I see all of that, the same things happening to Palestinians and Gaza and the West Bank. There are so many examples of how Israel is a violent settler colonial state committing a genocide and an illegal occupation that spanned 75 years. There's so much evidence that it's staggering almost to point out the parallels. There are so many that you're spoiled for choice. They give examples every day for the last 75 years of how they're a settler colonial state.
Settler colonialism isn't about land and life, it's about death and erasure. And I would define settler colonialism as a system of erasure that is essentially anti-life. So at its essence, settler colonialism serves a genocidal function of removal and replacement. So these are obviously justified by the squatters proclaiming their indigeneity. But Indigenous people, as we know, don't cut Indigenous trees to prove their indigeneity. So settler colonialism is always going to be combated by settler refusal. Unfortunately, settler colonialism also means having a monopoly over violence. And this is where we are constantly at the forefront of these enormously violent battles for our lives, essentially.
Trying to define acts of violence and then arguing over whether that's the right terminology, to me, diminishes the people who are suffering through it or have suffered through it. If you think about what's happening to women who are pregnant in Gaza, the murder of pregnant women, of unborn children, all those things are part of a genocidal violence. So that's how I would define it. If the people who are experiencing genocide are telling you it's genocide, then it is genocide. If bombs are being rained down on them and they're telling you that this is a genocide, then it is. And there's no way that anybody can look at what Israel is doing and the United States backing it as being anything but that, under the UN Convention definitions, but even under the community definition of what's happening to them.
My name is Jennifer Mohanam. I'm an assistant professor of critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also a longtime, almost 20 years now, organizer in the Bay Area Palestinian and Arab community, as well as organizing transnationally in the Palestinian transnational community. I was an early sort of founder and international board member of the Palestinian youth movement. I've since then, in the last few years, left PYM, and I'm now with the Palestinian Feminist Collective. I'm also the founder of that organization. So very grounded in community spaces and doing the work outside of the job. I think the settlement plays a really important role in the place of settler colonialism. Like, we've seen colonialism and different forms of empire, I think, exist in our region. And even preceding the Zionist colonization of Palestine, which I would consider a settler colonialism, we had, for example, the British mandatory period in Palestine. And in that period, there was sort of a militarized presence for Britain, and there was an administrative presence for Britain. But the historical analysis kind of goes that the British and the French and other parts of this region, so Lebanon, Syria, but they didn't have the intention of necessarily staying in the land as much as ensuring their access to resources in these different places. The Zionist project is a settler project. The project seeks to exterminate and replace the native population and then nativize themselves through that process. And so we see many waves of settlement facilitated by Zionist organizations, far predating the Second World War and far predating the Palestinian Nakba, but really getting crystallized within a governmental form in 1948 when the state declared itself. But the earliest waves happened in the late 1800s, and there were different sort of enclaves and land grabs, purchasing, but also a lot of gang violence and forced removals and massacres in order to enable that sort of replacement strategy.
So my name is Mark Mensch de Leon. I'm an assistant professor of English at UC Riverside. I'm also an enrolled member of the Susanville Indian Rancheria, which is in Northern California, or Northeastern California, to be exact. I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Gabrieleno peoples in the Los Angeles Basin, Culver City. And I'm also descended from Mountain Maidu, Pit River, and Washoe ancestors. I think this idea of this being a debate about whether or not we call this genocide is, in some sense, like, not only does it contribute to the dehumanization of Palestinians right now who are undergoing an assault beyond my imagination, in terms of like the amount of death, in terms of the destruction of their society, in terms of the lack of any recognition that, you know, people should intervene, right, in this kind of situation. I think all of that clearly shows the need for us to be able to use language like genocide and why there is this pushback, right, against the term. At the same time, I think there is a conversation to be had about the term genocide itself and how it operates, right? Because it does have different meanings depending on how it's talked about, the position from which it's being said, that I think are really relevant here. And I think one of the confusions that happens is that people tend to cross these different borders because the term has such fluidity. It's not just like a definitional sort of argument about whether we can apply international human rights law in this particular instance, even while that is a particularly useful thing to draw on, right? It's a kind of lever of power that I think is useful when one wants to get things done, like getting a fucking genocide to stop. And so you have to draw on that language. I'll just give a couple of historical examples that make clear some of the limitations of the term genocide, right? So Amy Cesar pointed out in 1950, this was 2 years after its codification, that the definition was created only after Europeans were affected by this type of violence, right? This ignored centuries of colonial violence, deaths of hundreds of millions of non-Europeans around the globe. Also, just this is something that has been pointed out recently by numerous people, but the fact that 1948 is an important year, both for the codification of the UN Convention on Genocide, but also because it's the year that the State of Israel was created. And so the Nakba was taking place at that time. So I think it's really important to understand from what position the use of the term is being derived.
A lot of us point to the United Nations definition of genocide, right? I have it pulled up right here just so I can reference it. They have a definition They have A through E, small parts of the definition, right? That's killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And then E is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The definition is saying that it doesn't need to be all of these. It can just be one of those. And we're seeing every single one happening right now in Gaza, in, the West Bank. So it's really an old argument for Indigenous people to say that this is genocide. And it's a really old argument for old historians to say it's ethnocide. Like the semantics of the bullshit is, continuing today.
In some ways, that quote unquote debate, and I hate that term here, but that debate is not about something neutral or objective, right? It's really about the power of the term itself. It's a way that there's a kind of registration of how it becomes a tool within kind of a colonial situation that Israel in the genocide that it's engaging in, right? And so the use of the term, the reason why I think that there's a lot of pushback is because if you recognize that there's a genocide going on, then it starts to also open up all of the other questions around the terminology that exist, as well as the different types of ideology that have been used. I mean, the term war, do we call this a war? Clearly not. It's an occupied population that has nowhere to go. They're in an open air prison. That term does not make sense, right? And so keeping it at the level of a war, and in particular a war against so-called terror, right, which is another word that has this long ideological history and representation, particularly of Arabs, in the United States and Israel, that's another word that people will start to question.
There's no doubt in my mind that Israel is a settler colonial state, really the crux of its foundation being predicated on the eradication of Palestinian life. They've made that clear. Their leaders have said as much openly. They're not ashamed. They're not ashamed of these viewpoints. So I'm really just reiterating what they themselves have said. And there's many parallels with Indigenous peoples in this hemisphere, as well as in California in particular. And one of the ones I think is most shocking, or it's not surprising, but it's shocking in the magnitude of its violence, is the relationship between settler colonial dispossession and carceral logics of punishment. And I named carceral logics in my own research, some of them being about containment, removal, surveillance, just punishment in general. These are the carceral logics of settler colonialism. And I see them so much side by side with, we think about historically in California, the dispossession or invasion and dispossession and occupation really being facilitated by the development of these carceral sites through military forts. And that those weren't, we think of them now, they're just forts, as you drive through California, but they were really hubs through which carceral violence in the service of dispossession could be executed. And so confinement at these forts, in native languages, in Wiyot, Jauruchguri is the word for Fort Humboldt. It means curled up on the floor. It's a name. It's a name for the treatment they received there, as well as the incarceration of many hundreds of California Indian resistors. I'm naming that to say, it is so chilling to read those historical reports, these archival reports of how our people were treated in these places, and then to witness the incarceration rates in Gaza and the West Bank, where 40% of adults have been incarcerated. Every single Palestinian has somebody who has in their immediate family who's been taken, kidnapped, and incarcerated, much like the forts that created kind of satellite posts through where the United States could further entrench its territorial sovereignty and invasion in California. It's very much the same. I see it happening as the same as how they removed, segregated, sequestered Palestinian people from their homelands into carceral sites. We might call them reservations. Of course, Gaza has been called the largest open air prison in the world, but that all of these technologies, it's not that they're exactly the same, but that there are echoes throughout these different times, but all of them, they're not incommensurate just because they're across the world, that a lot of these same architects are studying each other. Israel has a very close relationship with the buildup of the prison industrial complex in the United States. And that's not just a recent thing. So carcerality has always been a part of dispossession. My research points that out in California. And so when I talk about the dispossession of Palestinians and the genocidal violence enacted against them by the illegal state of Israel, I cannot but feel not just a solidarity, but a kinship with those people, a real understanding, or not understanding, but I just, it's so familiar what they're going through. I recognize the violence of their state because we've lived under the violence of this one.
You cannot compare the state of Israel to Gaza in any kind of way, like in terms of the access to the international community, in terms of the access to the media, in terms of the access to weapons, and to the United States in particular. Like these are not comparable situations. But there is a kind of ideological reversal that goes on by being like, from the river to the sea is a call for genocide, intifada, right? Uprising. Both of these are terms about the liberation of Palestinians. And yet, at the same time, they are being squeezed into the term genocide. And so in general, it's like a concerted effort to reduce the language that's available to call Israel's colonization and violent actions what they are. So I think the only other thing I just want to mention about that is recently Netanyahu stated that any calls for the investigation into Israel for war crimes is itself a form of pure anti-Semitism. And I think that should be like transparently showing the way that this is a war of words, like it really is. Whether or not we use the term genocide right now really, really matters because it's what we have in order to combat a system that, is oppressing and killing Palestinian people.
Shemi Sunway, my name is Morningstar Gali. Morningstar Gali ilk atage Chi'i, ma'ajumawi is Chi'i. My name is Morningstar Gali, and I'm a member of the Ajumawi tribe in northeastern California. We are located in what is known as the 100-mile square, which is between Shasta, Modoc, Lassen, and Siskiyou counties. I am currently residing on Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu occupied lands outside of Sacramento, California. And I have an organization called Indigenous Justice. And I've also been working for the past 15 years as the California Tribal and Community Liaison for the International Indian Treaty Council. The links that we are seeing in this genocide that's happening before all of our very eyes is very similar to the genocide that took place against California Indian peoples. For our territories, we had what is known as gold, greed, and genocide. We had an era that was just all-out massacre and plundering and theft of resources. For California Native peoples, we saw an era of missionization, the enslavement and building of the California mission system. And so the horror that we are witnessing on social media, and that is very filtered by mainstream media, is very much what our great-grandparents who were forced marched away from our tribal homes and onto reservations. What we are witnessing is, a real life version of what happened to California Indian peoples over 180 years ago. And so that's why for myself and so many within our California Indian communities are organizing in support and organizing in solidarity and recognizing that these are parallel issues and that the importance of this being an Indigenous issue is of such importance at this time. With California Indian peoples, it was a massacre rate of up to 98% of our tribal populations. And so entire tribes, the neighboring tribe to my nation, to the Pit River Nation of the Yana and the Yahi peoples, particularly the Yahi peoples, where we now have descendants, but does not exist as a people, as a nation, as a language that is spoken. When I worked as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for my tribe, for Pit River Tribe, it was a heavy responsibility. Not only was it a management of 3.5 million acres to protect, but it was also an issue around the sovereignty and autonomy of our peoples and the connection to the land. And so the parallel is that we are seeing entire families, we are seeing entire family names, entire generations of children now that are experiencing the trauma that's occurring through the targeting of their people, the experience of California Indian peoples being gold, greed, and genocide. We are seeing that for resource extraction. We are seeing that in terms of land theft. We are seeing that and witnessing that in terms of bombing a people and generations of people for the exchange of land and for the exchange of resources.
So the United States is funding a huge part of this. And because of our own, as in, the United States' own reflection, the mirror's up right now. And a lot of people don't want to see that. They don't want to look and see that their ancestors were part of, this horrific genocide. They don't want to think of themselves as part of it right now. No one wants to see themselves as this bad colonial power that's hurting millions of people. But at the same time, I think that's why the narrative is switched, right? That we don't want to be confronted with our own histories here. But at the same time, what we're doing right now, is a direct part of our actions here. Because if we stood up and said we're not going to allow our tax dollars to be funded, used for missiles to Israel, if we really stopped, then we can say we were part of that resistance of that. But we're not. When I say we as in the United States, just the fact that the narrative is so polarized, especially in the media and the news. We're saving Israel from this terrorist group, quote unquote, right? Because we know they're not terrorists. They're not a terrorist group. They are a resistance group that was formed. And we had resistance groups from Native people, right? We had people that were running away from missions. We had people who were setting missions on fire. We had people who were organizing, but we don't ever want to talk about, the activist part of it or the, the resistance part of it, because the United States wants to have that history of, Indian people just lived in harmony with, their colonizers, which did not happen.
One of the things that settler colonialism has a tendency to do is to attempt to create a kind of homogenized notion of the subject, right? And so in this case, it's well known, historically documented, that Palestine was a deeply plural society, right? You had Arab Muslims, Arab Jews, Arab Christians that all existed within the space for generations, if not a millennia, right? And so one of the things that what was happening here was that there was going to be, in some sense, a kind of project, an artificial creation of a nation state, which wasn't there, right? Palestine wasn't a nation state. And so it was going to be the creation of a nation state that was going to be specifically for one type of subject, right? And that particular subject was going to be the normative one, which isn't to say that there are not Palestinians living within what is called Israel proper, but they exist with a completely different sense of what their relationship to the state is than Israeli citizens who are Jewish, right? And so the goal was always the displacement of an indigenous population by what was a largely European population at the time, right? And how it was imagined when they were first beginning to plan this. At the very least, it was one conceived by a European entity to solve what was then the so-called European, quote unquote, Jewish problem, right? Which includes, as we all know, incredibly violent forms of anti-Semitism. This was something that was related to both European anti-Semitic relationships to Jewish people that have been there for generations, as well as European forms of Orientalism and their sort of imperial relationships to, a place like Palestine.
To prove that genocide occurred is to, participate in a kind of ghoulish mathematics that actually just entrenches the violence in the academe. I see a lot of straw man arguments coming out of occupied Palestinian homelands right now that are these people aren't racially Arab. They're showing different phenotypes and saying, what do you mean this isn't about race? That's part of why I'm saying I think things can transcend racial phenotype and expectation and linguistic and cultural. But the idea is that these aren't indigenous peoples in their homelands who are being targeted spiritually, physically, reproductively, and environmentally to be eradicated, removed, and displaced elsewhere in the world. That to me is enough evidence to say this is a genocide. When we get into the minutia of destroying this much groundwater equals this much death, and therefore it is or isn't genocide, that is less compelling to me because it would methodologically, it's disgusting, but also it doesn't help these people get free. I think we need to name all of the things that the Israeli government is doing to destroy Palestinian life and name genocide in those places. And this also extends beyond these moments, like these 70 days or so days. We need to think about genocide more capaciously because it goes across time as well. This is a 75-year occupation. And genocide scholars, I find, like to take a couple of years and say something about those years. But I would like us to use genocide to say something about this illegal state.
The Nakba's ongoing, right? It's something that has continued. It has not stopped since 1948. But the initial sort of like beginning stages of this, what happened was, 15,000 Palestinians were killed in over 70 massacres. You had the removal of 750,000 Palestinians from their homelands who were moved into neighboring countries as refugees. The reason why I say that the Nakba continues is because, even right from the beginning stages of this, the UN General Assembly saw that, there was like a significant problem going on. And so they actually passed a resolution that called for the right of return, that called for property restitution and compensation to Palestinians, right? This was in 1948, at the beginning of stages of this. And 75 years later, there have been multiple other resolutions that have been passed. And of course, none of them have helped. None of them have done anything. Palestinians continue to face the destruction of their society, culture, identity, political rights. The Nakba has seen a near total destruction of Palestinian civil society with the destruction of over 500 villages, the ongoing refusal of the right of return, the creation of permanent refugee camps, right? So refugee camps were created, and now at this point, generations have lived and died in these refugee camps. They have been permanent refugees. And, and then you have the brutal occupation, harassment, and violence of Palestinians in all of the different parts of what is now Palestine, right? You have the creation of illegal settlements in the West Bank. You have the displacement of Palestinians in Jerusalem, and then, of course, the siege in Gaza. And I also just want to note that since 1967, the Arab-Israeli War, as it's called, Israel's occupation and erosion of Palestine, as defined by the 1948 borders, has operated through a form of colonial domination. Israel has taken on as its sole determination the ability to define what Palestinian life looks like in these conditions. It does this through blockades of Gaza, apartheid borders, checkpoints, laws, a carceral system in which something like 40% of Palestinian men have been incarcerated at some point, settlements in the West Bank in which settlers illegally occupy Palestinian lands and the Israeli military physically supports them, that these act as the vanguard for Israel. Laws are created to retroactively make settlements legal, and this is against international law. This was also the precise mechanism used by the US. It's one that operates through fanaticism and stochastic violence, as well as a retroactive process of making law by breaking it before it even exists. Sometimes condemnation of the settlers by the state is necessary. It happened here in the US. It happens, in Israel occasionally. Not as often, I don't think, but they ultimately are the force through which Israel normalizes conquest and seizes land. So for all those reasons, I think it's pretty clear to me that Israel has been and, always has been and continues to be a settler state.
But I also think that settler colonialism, more than anything, is a structure that is constantly trying to hide its failures. It is an invasion that is ongoing, yes, but it is ongoing because it is constantly and utterly perplexed with how to handle indigenous duration. Settler colonialism also makes sort of the fatal error of assuming that the conquered population is conquered permanently. And it wants us to believe in the myth of settler permanence, that there's no way out of it, that it's a fait accompli. And I think it is our job to always remember that we know better and that that's not the case, right? That it's not a given.
I can't imagine looking at this genocide and even saying, like, when people are like the war that's happening, which sometimes, these slippages, they can matter. And I catch myself too, to be like, this isn't a war. These people don't have a military. These are civilians being carpet bombed. To look away from that, or people wanting to parse words about this isn't a genocide. Both sides have aggression. Both sides are wrong. That kind of, you sound like an elected official in the United States, right? You sound like a Democrat by saying that. Really, it's it's just liberal cowardice and an absolute allegiance to white supremacist power around the globe. That's the only thing I can think of why there would be a turning away from this and calling it genocide. And it makes perfect sense because the United States itself is also founded on white supremacist violence. And so, of course, they can't see it. Like, it's very inviting. It's very seductive to turn away from that definition, I think, or that impulse to turn away, because it looks too much like looking in a mirror.
What I see is larger systems of colonization that are operating around the world, around the globe. It's a form of colonialism in which a colonial force founds a new civil society, right? And it does this by displacing indigenous societies. And this displacement generally takes place through removals, genocidal violence, assimilation policies, as well as the complete disruption of existing relationships to the land.
So my family is absolutely indigenous to Palestine. They are indigenous to the city. We can trace that history for at least 1,300 years, but possibly longer. It's definitely a place-based identity to be indigenous. And to be place-based doesn't always necessarily mean that you get to have the privilege of being in the place if you're Palestinian, given the conditions of violent military occupation. But it does mean that there is something about belonging that is extremely powerful. The Palestinian indigenous epistemology, or way of thinking, way of existing, is that we Palestinians belong to this place, Palestine, to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, has been cultivated by our ancestors. And we have living evidence to show this. We have the oldest olive tree in the world, which is believed to be about 6,000 years between Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the village of Al-Walaja. And you can go visit and learn that there are living, breathing markers of our connection to this place. We belong to Palestine. And this is different than settler states that make claims that land belongs to them, that this land belongs to us, vis-a-vis private property and colonial notions of supremacy, European entitlement. To call myself indigenous is a political act. It's not a passive descriptor. So it's not sort of like I'm describing, a pattern of people who've been dispossessed. In fact, I take issue with a lot of writing that talks about indigenous people simply as people who have been dispossessed. That's not the end of our story, right? And that's one painful chapter. Settler colonialism is a project of presence taking, right? It's the project of erasing the indigenous. So indigenous also reminds us of the responsibility we have to this land, and that our presence itself is political, right? The thing is about settler colonialism is that it's always has like one major glaring deficiency. And that is that it requires my people's erasure. But my people, we don't require anyone's erasure to live.
The question of indigeneity is a bit more complex in a region like Palestine or the Arab world because it's had more contact over many, many more centuries, I think, than some of the other places that we typically think of as being within a settler colonial context or having indigenous communities. So that's something I'm actively thinking through, and I don't have any answers for. My family, my village, my tribes trace their roots back for, I think, at least 1,000 years within the region, and there's some substantiated evidence for that. And so I would consider my family, my roots, my community as indigenous to the region. I think the connections to the land and the caring for the land, the caring for those that inhabit the land, I think that really embodies an indigenous practice of care and connection to those regions. There's a decimation of our land happening right now. I don't know how anyone with claims to indigeneity of a land could just decimate the earth that is beneath them in the ways that are happening now at the hands of the Zionist military.
Like all Western states, Israel exploits the land. It destroys indigenous environments to render the land, quote unquote, more productive, to make the desert bloom, as they say. It's a deeply militaristic society that, despite its claim to be a democratic society, operates through severe forms of fascism and the suppression of dissent. I think indigenous societies in general have been understood to be deeply pluralistic, right? And so this isn't to romanticize sort of like pre-Israel Palestine. Like there were certainly conflicts, just like there were conflicts, here amongst indigenous people. But, it is to try to understand that the formation of the state of Israel, just like the formation of the US, sought to produce a homogenous sense of the subject through the violent exclusion of social orders that pre-existed them. So for those reasons, I think there's a kinship to talk about.
I think with a term like indigenous, there are, unfortunately, those who are more interested in proving or disproving something. And what I've learned over the years, both as a Palestinian and as an academic, is that the core of place-based identities is often beyond any category or definition, right? Indigeneity to me is not about populations that check certain boxes or fit a perfect timeline trajectory. If we think about prior to settler invasions, whoever really identified as, quote unquote, indigenous, so to speak, right? We just were. And so for me, it's about a collective, centuries-long, multi-generational experience with the land that roots us somewhere and defines who we are in ways that often surpass the constraints of academic analysis. And the truth is that today, so much of the indigenous experience is also wrapped up in loss. Being indigenous has also come to be an existence that's under threat in every way. And Palestine lives in me and my family far beyond that loss. It lives in music and language and traditions and foodways. But admittedly, to deny that loss, to deny that that loss is a core part of our understanding of our indigeneity would also, I think, be inaccurate for me.
I look at my Palestinian relatives and what's happening over there, and it breaks my heart because we see what's occurred in so many places across the world. But to us as California Native people, we understand the extent of genocide. And, I think about it and I was like, it's not just like California, but it's across Turtle Island, what we now call the United States, and both north to us and south of us, this whole continent of what has happened to indigenous people. And the trying to ethnically cleanse people from their land sites, to erase them from ever existing. And, I can imagine, we're seeing this in real time through social media and through all of these different access points that we have now. But, when this was happening to our own people on our own lands, that wasn't possible. The world didn't see what was happening. We absolutely see what's happening right now, the thousands and thousands of people that are dying that are innocent.
Settler colonialism is generally sort of motivated by different logics of supremacy, right? You have these ways in which it justifies itself. You have the usual dichotomies of civilization versus so-called savagery, primitive. You have modernity versus tradition. And it ends up sort of mapping these Eurocentric formations onto completely different contexts and environments, right? So it sort of replicates itself. You have East and West as a kind of orienting device. You have the way that something like the Orient, the Occident, actually got mapped onto indigenous peoples here as one example, right? So this is something that, operated throughout the history of colonization. And so these types of evaluations within a settler colonial context are used to deem indigenous people as being unfit to be stewards of the land. And these often include religious justifications, such as manifest destiny, Zionism for this conversation. But a settler state cannot, by definition, be a nation, right? Like it's not logically possible. It's a foreign entity replacing indigenous worlds through violence. And so because of this, I think of settler colonialism as something that's haunted by this sort of deep insecurity that is directly linked to the concept of indigeneity. And so settlers will often perform amazing mental gymnastics in order to overcome this insecurity. This ranges from sort of liberal sentimentalism and romanticization of indigenous peoples, all the way to hardline conservative critiques and suppression of any discourse that discusses this sort of logical conundrum, and in particular is related to anti-colonial movements. Elizabeth Pavanelli, for instance, has called this paradoxical aspect it's what she calls the governance of the prior. It's kind of like the maintenance that settler states employ of the category of indigeneity. It's something that needs to be managed in order to secure the continuation of the system itself.
And what we're looking at is this settler colonial idea of this insatiable desire to take and take and take. And as they're taking, they are dehumanizing people that are from that land or have been the caretakers of that land for thousands and thousands of years. Watching the bulldozing of the olive trees that have been there for hundreds of years, and to look at the landscape changing in devastating ways. I see this correlation between what happened to our people here in Lashawn territory through the missionization and the changing of our life and the imprisonment of our people, the ways that they can't go back home, just like our ancestors were unable to go back home once we were imprisoned at the missions, and that we weren't able to gather our own food.
There are conversations around really trying to draw parallels. Those are extremely important conversations to be had. But for someone who's kind of been part of movement work, they're inextricably linked. The ways in which our land and our sources of sustenance for Palestinians, our lands, our trees, our groves burned and uprooted, our histories, here I'm saying Palestinian histories, our languages, cultures, were and continue to be punitively silenced and erased. We've learned how similar that experience has been and continues to be for Indigenous communities on Turtle Island. We've learned about the stories of and the horrors of residential schools on Turtle Island. And in accomplishing the logics of settler colonialism, that punitive violence forced upon our Indigenous families and communities, our peoples, is one that we experience.
As a Palestinian, I'm connected to Palestine through stories and people that came before me. So my ancestors, my elders, my parents. And I've mentioned that many of us are displaced all over the world, but we maintain a connection to our land as part of our identity. And it's one that continues to persist across time and space. So in my own personal biography, I guess, I was born to a Palestinian father who was born in the Gaza Strip. Palestinians do not identify their place of belonging by where they're born, but by where their ancestors come from. And my father comes from a different place than Gaza called Al-Khalil. Al-Khalil is a really famous city, a famous Palestinian city in the West Bank under occupation currently, but it's a historic city and a biblical city. So Al-Khalil is actually an Arabic word that means companion. And it's a shorthand for Khalilullah, which means the companion of God. And the reason why the city is called that is because Abraham, who is someone very important to all the monotheistic faiths, is buried there, as is Sarah, his wife. And these are shrines that Palestinians have protected for hundreds of years that are very important to us, but that we are actively denied from. Growing up in under occupation, my father always says that if he didn't leave, he would either be dead or in prison. So ultimately, he arrived in the United States in the 1970s with nothing but a hope and a prayer, not a lot of money, and worked odd jobs. And this is kind of the fate of many Palestinian people, because our displacement is an ongoing displacement. Our settler colonialism is an activated settler colonialism. So a lot of people have to leave to survive. He ended up in South Central Los Angeles in the 1970s. And as I mentioned, worked in various places and fields, eventually would gather enough money, go back to Palestine and marry my mother, who he had known since he was a child, bring her to Los Angeles, and they'd have 3 children. Eventually, over the years, my mother would become a voice for Palestinians in Southern California, in the Los Angeles diaspora. And we were raised to love Palestine and to understand that this is our place of belonging, even when it was and continues to be an identity that is deeply erased or repressed here in the United States. So over the years growing up, I learned that our relationship to land is one of deep and profound love, but also this idea of belonging. And that's very different. For Indigenous people, we say we belong to the land. We don't say that the land belongs to us. That's very different than the settler capitalist framework. But these relationships and this love, I should say, has been maintained through stories about the harvest and practices too. So in my example, growing up in Los Angeles, California in the 1980s, if my father saw an olive tree that was behind a McDonald's that was fully, fully flourishing and had olives, it was a responsibility to go and harvest them. Even if everybody was going to stare at us like we were crazy, what he was giving me was in some ways a gateway to my history and to my identity as a Palestinian, all of which really revolve around the olive tree.
Because most of my work is based in the environment, I think a lot about environmental violence and how environmental violence is a tool of settler colonialism to destroy our landscape and our homelands, our waters, for the benefit of the settler colony. So that would be for the benefit, in my mind, here in California, for agricultural businesses, for utilities, or energy corporations. And you see that happening with the investment in pipelines and the investment of critical infrastructure, water infrastructure projects, the continued fracking that happens here in California and beyond that, and transnational like pipelines that exist from Canada to Indigenous homelands down to the south, right? Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline is a huge part of that transnational oil and gas industry. Seeing that in Gaza as well, with British Petroleum putting in permits for gas and oil off the Gaza coastline. You see that with the destruction of olive trees. So olive trees are functionally very important to Palestinian farmers and Palestinian people in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. There's more than 10 million olive trees, mostly native olive trees, drought-resistant varieties that are continuously destroyed by both settlers, Israeli settlers, and the Israeli military. And that's just ramping up as we're seeing the violence that's occurring right now in Gaza, and then the overlapping violence in the West Bank. Human rights organizations point this out and have been pointing this out for decades, that Israeli settlers claim land in violation of United Nations resolutions and regularly attack Palestinian farmers and prevent them from reaching ancestral lands.
Palestine's like a central kind of coastal region, so the merchant classes were more in the coast. My family's inland, more east. My family's from the more eastern part, northeast of Jerusalem. And then you have the holy sites, and there's some tourism destinations. So it varies. You have like the traders and the merchants on the coast. Most of our coast was taken, except for Gaza, which now we're seeing them perhaps trying to take right now. We have the Dead Sea. We have the different sites where Jesus lived and was born. And so we have a very rich history in Palestine. So it does have a bit more of a diverse economy, I think, than other places in the region. But I would say the large majority of Palestinians sustain themselves through that more localized farming economy. I would say a majority of Palestinians are from a peasantry class. So, like, depending on where people were located, their form of sustenance was mainly tending to lands and shepherding animals and things like that. So I know my own family had olive tree groves, and that was a big form of sustenance for my family. And, I think prior to the different more modern colonialisms in Palestine, life was really simple in that sense, in terms of like, we move with the seasons, we tend to the land, our olives produce and olive oil produce our, sustenance for the year. And then there's like the trading, and maybe we have some animals. And a lot of Palestinian families are still villagers. I think olives and olive oil are a huge form of sustenance for Palestinians across Palestine even today.
Olive trees have become such a signifier of Palestinian landscapes, of Palestinian identity, of our culture. So just a real quick point about olive oil. It is liquid gold in Palestinian culture, our ancient trees that have been taken care of by my greats and the greats and the great, for generations, with the idea of taking care of us, of the generations to come. So how do we deal with this olive tree? Well, it doesn't look like Europe, and maybe we can make it look more like home. So let's destroy, uproot these trees systematically, right? The olive trees of the Holy Land. Let's raise and destroy them and uproot them, and we'll replace them with pine. But again, this is very hard to sustain. It also means water apartheid. So now we're talking about an ecological occupation in which the olive trees are now also under a military occupation. They've actually been declared in Israeli policy as an extension of Palestinian terrorism. The universal symbol of peace, ironically, right? And they have to be removed and replaced, just like the Palestinian people. We do that by burying them in the ground and replacing them with these pine trees, and we create these nature reserves. These nature reserves are able to be facilitated by stealing indigenous land, right? And this land is still actively being stolen now, and stealing water. Right? So water apartheid and ecological occupation converge in just a single example of the olive tree as a symbol of Palestine that has to be replaced. These are all important elements of land, right? And this desire for return. As Winona LaDuke says, that, and like for other indigenous people, land is the source of all of our relations. And indigenous environmentalists like Winona LaDuke have long taught us that land, water, plants, ecologies, seasons, trade relations, food and diet, indigenous rights, land, they're all deeply connected, right, to land. And I also want to say that I think this is very promising because if, in the words of Nick Estes, he says that our history is the future for environmentalism, for conceptualizing beyond partition and borders and violence. Prior to the State of Israel, Palestinian land was almost completely communal. The British eventually would introduce the notion of private property, and this would create the conditions of possibility for European settler colonial invasion through the formation of the State of Israel on indigenous Palestinian lands in 1948. And since then, we have seen our lands completely desecrated, partitioned, and violated, along with our people. The Holy Land's oldest cities in the world are either under occupation or are being buried with tanks. In the place of our olive trees, our orange trees, and our prickly pear, the settler state has installed a violent apartheid regime that continues to encroach upon our lands. The place where our prophets were born have been razed to the ground. We can tell you the people who planted the prickly pear.
This was very similar to what settlers did in the 1850s to my people during what was known as the Northwest Indian Wars, quote unquote. And I think we should really interrogate the use of the word war. Because when a settler military operation occupies people, that's not a war by any definition. And when people fight back, that's actually fight back against their occupation. That's not what constitutes a war. That's resistance. And so my people, the Hupa people, and neighboring tribes, the Yurok and Karuk peoples, were occupied by the United States military and state-funded militias. So in Hupa, there's a military fort established called Fort Gaston that's established in Hupa Valley. And it's established to quell the attacks that Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples were weighing against settlers who were coming in and violently attacking Native people. And so the United States military sets up this fort to stop these attacks on non-native settlers. So people who were attempting to settle the valley, driving Hupa people out. And so as a part of that environment, that's very genocidal violence. So the military being used to come in and destroy Hupa life and Yurok and Kruk life. There's also this thing that happens where timber industries are established in the years after the Northwest Indian Wars, quote unquote. And we see that in Palestine too, with the destruction of olive trees, with the destruction of water systems that was happening prior to 2023. So UNICEF in 2019 called this a instance that violates international humanitarian law and puts civilians at unnecessary risk. 2019. Phosphorus that's being dropped from the sky right now, which is a war crime. It's considered a war crime. Is contaminates soils, bodies of water, and animals, including fish. Gazans depend on fish, much like Hupas depend on fish. Yuroks and Kruks depend on salmon and fish for our sustenance. I mean, there's no way when you compare the two or talk about the two in concert that you can't see it as anything other than what it is, which is this function of settler colonial violence, but also genocidal violence. And the reason I say that, and sometimes people bristle when I say that environmental violence is a function of genocidal violence, I say that because we are the land. That's how we view ourselves. We are this land. Like Hupas, I can speak as a Hupa person. We are that land. We are the land. Our home, our valley is our land. It's us. Like we are the fish. We are the land. And so when that's destroyed, it's destroying us too. Like many Hupa, Yurok, and Kruk people will tell you that you cannot function being Hupa, Yurok, or Kruk anymore if our river or our salmon or our land is dead. We cease to exist. And so I always compare that very much to a genocidal violent mandate. And it's a part of the settler colonial project to continue that. So I just think about this a lot between California Native people and Palestinians, and not even just the physical violence, because my people survived a genocide. I'm only here because my ancestor Fanny went into the woods and protected her friend. Like that's really the only reason that I'm here. It's because we resisted and pushed back, and we survived, and she survived, and her son survived. I mean, that's the reality that people who are descendants of genocide live with. And it's hard to see that happening today, and people denying that is happening when more than 20,000 people are dead, mostly children, women, men, elders. Targeted attacks, which is what the United States military did to us too. Targeted our people, targeted our leaders, targeted our elders, our children. So if you think about the Indian Island massacre, those are women and children and elders. There's no way you can't see what's happening as that not being a function of genocide, as that not being genocide. So I think I very much see the parallels between us and them. And even if that had never happened to my people, it wouldn't be hard to parallel that either. So the Klamath River Reservation was established to also work to quell these attacks that Yuroks and Karuks and Tolowa people were laying against, settlers in the region that were committing violent acts against them. They were really messing with livestock too. So that was like something that a lot of the native people up there did. They would like destroy livestock and farms in the region. And so Fort Terweer is established on the Klamath River Reservation to, stop these attacks from happening. But what ends up happening is that the fort is destroyed by the river. The Klamath River destroys it in a flood. And so I always think, the land is fighting back too.
So ecological occupation is naming this vanishing of Palestinian biodiversity. About 500 million birds fly over Palestine every single year, right? It is, again, a deeply biodiverse place. And we're seeing that diversity also being taken from us when you have installations of foreign plants on our indigenous plants. But I don't call it ecocide or eco-genocide because occupation is something that can end. And we know the plants that belong in Palestine. So in some ways, that term is a bit subversive because it suggests that occupations cannot last forever. And this Palestine will be free and we will replant. This is something that Palestinians are largely agricultural people, mostly communal lands. We're great at sharing and we're great at planting. And this is something that we're going to do when we have our land back, when we have our right of return. And that's something that we are committed to every day.
I don't know the psychology of Zionist or right-wing people who tend to think of this as being justified. And the only things I've ever seen is on, reading message boards or reading New York Times articles that are defending what's happening, which I can barely stomach. But is that, October 7th, they started it without any kind of historical context into the generations of violence that Palestinians have had to live with and live through. I think that when you believe in a settler mentality, that you have the right to this land, what is the Zionist talking point? We make the desert bloom, right? A land without people. Like that this was a land without people. That's what settlers here used too in the United States, terra nullius, empty land. There's nobody here, which is false. Obviously, there was many cultures and people here in the United States where we were destroyed. In the United States, I think the justification becomes very much the justification of our destruction here of Native American people, right? We didn't have rights to land. We weren't being useful with it. And these are documents that you see and documentation you see over and over again. Water wasted to the sea. They're wasting water and going into the sea. That's what justifies making these environmentally destructive projects for capitalism, for capital, for major agricultural businesses. So I always focus on agriculture, but also like oil and gas companies, major energy conglomerates. Like those are all things that justify the world that we live in. Like to live in this world, other people have to be destroyed. And the other is always indigenous people. Tends to be indigenous people. It's very much an othering too, right?
Dehumanization being a big part of kind of greasing the engine of the structure of genocidal violence, eradication, and replacement of settler colonialism. So in order to sell all these technologies or practices to your citizenship, right? Who the citizens, let's say, of the United States, think of themselves as good, as think of themselves as moral, belonging, right? Arbiters of the good life, right? They have the family they're supposed to have, those things, that they really, in order to make that possible, that they have to do this really egregious genocidal violence. And so we have to make those two things fit. Like, how can I be the good settler subject, the good white normative subject, with my house, with my wife, with my children, all of whom I own in this plot of land? How can I imagine myself as the future of this nation state when there's these indigenous people here? And I have to eradicate them for my life and for my future to be realized. So in between those two things is a project of dehumanization. And this occurs in multiple ways. So for California Indians, we're often talked about as first lesser human. So that kind of scale of humanity, we have barbarians, we have savages, barbarians, and humans. That's from the pseudoscience of the day that indigenous peoples aren't human. So, and there's any number of science, that backs that up till not very long ago. And even still some now. So that's one, to name a kind of drawing on like Charles Darwin and stuff, the evolution of species, that we are where humans are supposed to be, in indigenous peoples, Black peoples, other non-white, displaced and marginalized peoples around the globe, that they are under us. And then one way to like prove that's the science. And then how do we prove that theory? One way to prove that theory is by likening them to disease. So contagion is one. So in California, we have people, California and in the West in the United States, we have a lot of sickness, a lot of malnourishment, a lot of death and dying, both slow and fast, of indigenous peoples because of disease, because they were starving us as part of their occupation. They cut down our oak trees, right? So we are sick, we're weak physically, and then they hold up this sick body and they say that that's its future. It's inevitable. They're dying out naturally. So again, that science and that linkage with an indigenous body to contagion, really, the foregone conclusion is that they were dying anyway. So they are something less than human because we can't grieve them as humans. They were always going to die. It's something like a remnant or a bit of flesh, which Black feminist theorizing does really well, talk about flesh. Also, indigenous peoples were linked to environmental destruction or pollution, or at the very least, like waste. So we don't make the land productive, or we're really getting in the way of the natural beauty of Yosemite. So we remove the indigenous people who are muddying up the pristine God's wilderness, right? And that's all mirror, conservation in California definitely has its, both its hands really in the mess of dehumanizing indigenous peoples. They really need to justify all the violence they do. And so pollution, contagion, of course, just criminalization. These are bad Indians. They're marauding. They are just attacking innocent settlers. It really decontextualizes what's actually happening here, and then puts all the blame on a presumed biological defect that's race science. So that's what is at work in California. And it's very much at work in occupied Palestinian homelands.
You have been listening to the first part of a 3-part special edition of the Challenging Colonialism podcast. This special series on Palestine is inspired by the outpouring of solidarity from indigenous communities in California and across the globe. As a podcast dedicated to breaking down patterns of ongoing colonialism, we recognize the necessity to help illuminate the commonalities of settler colonial violence happening in Palestine right now. The second part will discuss the right of return as a land-back movement and include an analysis of the role of new media in the face of genocide. while part 3 will focus on solidarity between various Native American and Palestinian communities, with a focus on November 2023's Alcatraz Indigenous Sunrise Ceremony, which was dedicated this year to Palestinian solidarity. In this episode, you have heard from Dr. Layla Sharif, Corina Gould, Dr. Noor Juda, Dr. Stephanie Lumsden, Dr. Mark Minch de Leon, Morningstar Gali, Rana Sharif, Dr. Brittany Arona, Dr. Rhonda Maewabi, Dr. Vanessa Escovedo, and Dr. Jennifer Mohana. Thank you for listening.